18 of those. And then Matthew is going to Florida in a couple weeks to work with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection that we've been working with all year long. We ran the mini course with them 4 times, and now we're doing this symposium thing with them, which will be 15-minute ABT talks from them, and then 5-minute ones for tomorrow is the let's see if I got that. This is, if anybody's got the time, we encourage you to tune in. And Matthew, maybe you can put the link in the chat window. This is may very well be our best, finest hour to date with the ABT. These are 18 medical students and doctors and faculty at Emory University in their medical school. And we've been teaching the course there for 4 years. So this is our 4th year and the best ever. I went there back in October and spent a few days with them. These talks are really razor sharp. They're all 5 minutes long, ABT, and bing, 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 one after another. And so anyhow, you're all invited if you want to tune in tomorrow at 10 o'clock our time, right? So that is that. And you got the link in there, Matthew?
I do.
Excellent. Okay. You don't need to RSVP. Okay, so here's at the core of everything that we're going to be talking about, and this is what we've been working with all of those people and all those presentations in the simplest of all levels, just for all broad communication, which is, everybody is obsessed with their deep, dense and material, all their information they're in love with, that they're desperately wanting to communicate to the masses. And you can get them into your and world. You just have to have a little patience and know that everybody is best off if they can start in the shallow end, and that's where the ABT tool becomes powerful and important. Matthew, do you like this little diagram? I just pulled it together this morning. It's what I've talked about for years. This idea that in your presentation, if you can just start the audience in the shallow end, just for a few minutes using the ABT, you can get everybody on board, and then you can lead them down into the deep end eventually, and all your wonderful and material that you're in love with. You can get them there. You just have to have the patience to make this journey from ABT, storytelling land, basically set up problem and solution dynamic, into then your mountain of info. I've dealt with this for years and years. I've had a bunch of bad experiences with it from time to time. One particular biotech company that I worked with for 2 or 3 years, and they had a culture there of and. They loved their information so much, and it was so dense and so thick that they just didn't want to touch it. And yet they asked me to come in and, can you make our talks interesting? And they had a big problem with people giving promotion talks. And they said when VPs from other departments come to these talks, when somebody from genetics shows up for a promotion talk for bioinformatics, they can't understand anything that's going on from the first slide. And I tried to explain this basic model. Look, all we got to do is a little soft intro with ABT there, and then we can get them into your deeper stuff. But they had a culture, literally, where they believed every talk needed to start with a graph, with a slide that had 6 graphs on it. You needed to flex your macho muscles from the first moment to show how much knowledge you have and intimidate the audience, and then try and make something out of it from there. And eventually we just all gave up. I just said, well, then that's bad communication. I can't do anything with you if you're telling me you want to stick to bad communication, yet you want me to make it good. It doesn't happen, doesn't add up. So this is the basic predicament. And we've got 3 folks to start off with here that are going to talk this, but it really encourage everybody, because everybody deals with this. Once you start to see the power of the ABT, you start to realize a lot of these organizations have got a longstanding culture of and so let me just talk about the 3 presentations. And I mean, they're not even presentations. We're just going to ask each person to share a few thoughts. Starting with Rocky Gutierrez, my long-term buddy, Northern California, who is a major expert on the issue of the spotted owl and all sorts of other conservation issues over the years. And he's been a big fan of ABT for a bunch of years. And he wrote me an email just a few weeks ago about a paper he had written, calls it a wiper, just a small little note for a journal. And he put it together and ran the ABT metrics on it and was very satisfied with the scores that he got there before, of perfect 2.5% and frequency that we've all come to know now, and then a very impressive high narrative index of 25, bingo, bullseye. Sent it in, and by the time the editors of the journal had got done with their revisions, they had pounded it into 3.0, and frequency and knocked the narrative index all the way down to 13. So I'm going to ask Rocky to talk about that. Basically, the AAA muscles dominated over the ABT dynamic. And here's the bottom line is they just said, sorry, you can take your ABT dynamics and go have fun with them, but we're not doing that in our journal. Secondly, well, actually, second is going to be Rick. I got this out of order. We'll have Rick go after him, and then Doug will talk. Our lawyer buddy, he and I just talked a short while ago. We co-authored this book of the ABT dynamics, and then he's going to talk about experiences he's had of trying to get the law world to understand ABT, and they're just so deeply entrenched in and he's been trying to write a bigger, broader book for the law world on ABT, and that's what he runs into. And then thirdly will be, or second, I'm going to have you go second, Rick, because you're going to play off of what Rocky's talked about. But Rick is a lifelong Fish and Wildlife Service, retired from there in North Dakota, and now runs a little thing called Conservation Notes with a bunch of his buddies there in North Dakota. And this is the most recent one that he writes them up as ABT, and by the time the group is done, they turn into and. So that is our basic dynamic we're going to be talking about here, confronting the and culture. And on that note, Rocky, you want to jump in and start sharing a few thoughts about what you have had for that experience. Tell us about that note to begin with, because you were kind of fired up when you wrote to me about that to begin with.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I think when I first met Randy and he gave a plenary talk at a meeting, and I immediately grasped this ABT as an intuitive way to communicate more effectively. And I tried it at one point, when I was asked to give a plenary just a year after that, and it went over so well. The editor of that journal of that particular society asked me to write my plenary up as a paper, which I did. Subsequent, I've had other experiences using ABT in which I've transformed papers that were having difficulty getting into journals and made a big success. But I had this recent experiment or experience where I submitted a paper to an international journal, a small paper, primarily because I was interested in having some Bhutanese colleagues have the experience of publishing a paper. And when I went through this review process and saw how they had transformed it greatly, it caused me to think about why there is this resistance and what might be the root causes. Because I've mostly seen it from colleagues where they don't want me to transform their paper into ABT, and I think there are a number of reasons for it, and I won't delve into those greatly, but what I will do is give you an overview, and then maybe we can talk about them
Well,
later.
let me ask you, you mentioned Bhutanese. Do you think that was an element in there? Is there a cultural divide there with their tendency to want to push things more in and direction?
No, it was not them. I was doing the lead work, and I was working with them, and they were all in agreement with what
Mm.
I had written.
So is the
So it was the
editors.
journal itself. The editor
Yeah.
took actually, this was the final revision that I sent in that had those metric scores that
Mhm.
I used your what I call a narrative illuminator. You call the ABT O meter, and I'll tell you
Gotcha.
why.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
why I call it the narrative illuminator rather than the ABT O meter later.
Yeah, Matthew, make a note of that. Maybe we should consider that as a new name.
Yeah.
I'm
I
sorry,
like it.
Yeah,
Rocky,
I
can
like.
I ask a
Yeah,
clarifying question?
yeah.
How did these edits happen? Were the editors actually changing things, or were the reviewers putting in required suggestions, which then you modified and it transformed the paper because in the course of addressing concerns, it kind of turns into an AAA?
No, this was the revision after reviews. So it was the final revision that the editor got a hold of after I had addressed all the reviewer concerns and the the subject editor had approved it. It got to the editor, and then they transformed it.
Oh, so the editor rewrote it.
Yeah,
Okay.
the
Interesting.
editor rewrote it.
Wow.
And,
Okay.
and as soon as I looked at it, I said, "Oh my God, what did they do this?" And I knew that something had happened. That's why I ran it through this because it was choppy and I think there's a historical root for that in that many journals used to put an emphasis on heavy editing to reduce the length of the paper to achieve um, saving space in a journal. But that's no longer relevant because this is an online journal, and many journals are online now where the
Yeah,
space.
but wait a second. That's kind of got to get balanced against the desire of everybody not reading anything anymore and wanting to keep things a little shorter, more concise for in that direction, don't you think? You got two things going. You're right. You now have unlimited space, but you've also got shortened attention spans.
Right, but we're talking a 500, 1,000, 1,200 word
Right. A little
paper.
short editorial
So
type.
it's
Was it
very short.
editorial? Was it an editorial type thing?
Yeah, it was a total editorial,
Yeah, gotcha.
you
Okay.
know,
And I'm sorry, did the edits shorten the paper or just turn it into mush?
mush.
Oh, so it wasn't
Well,
shortened and then clarity was lost. It
yeah,
was
well,
something
I
different.
think they were trying to shorten it, but they essentially saved maybe 40 words.
Okay.
Hmm.
Got
And
it.
in those 40 words, they transformed it into semi mush. And one of the things I've learned about publishing is once it gets that far, you don't argue with the editor. You just let it go and call it good because the objective is get the information out.
Which is
And
what that was the point where you got in touch with me, was you said, I'm just going to go ahead and let this thing ride and let them pound it into whatever they need to get it out. Yep.
yeah, exactly. I mean, at that point in time, I've learned long ago you don't argue with editors unless you want trouble. So anyway, I think there's some larger issues here that go back to things that Randy has talked about, why there is resistance among scientists. Um,
Well, how about if on that note, let's transition to Rick talking about the same sort of thing with give us the tale of conservation notes in North Dakota, Rick.
Good morning, everyone. So my experience is much like Rocky's. I met Randy many years ago, and in the course of our relationship, he came to North Dakota and gave a keynote address at the North Dakota chapter of the Wildlife Society annual meeting, and then put on a big workshop on ABT. And after that meeting, there were five of us who were past presidents and colleagues for federal employees, got together and decided we were going to put together these conservation notes, a monthly, short, concise, clear description of conservation issues in North Dakota, and they were to be targeted specifically for the state legislature. Things got off to a rocky start, so to speak, right out of the chute, because even though my friends saw the benefit and understood the concept, they couldn't grasp it. We started off anding right out of the chute. And over the course of several years, we got better. They got pretty good. And then after that, the last 3 or 4 years, they've just turned into giant ands. I sent Randy one last night that's hugely horrible, let me say that. And the concept again is very similar to what Rocky just described. They're just steeped in and when I would make suggestions about them, most of them would say, "Yeah, but we got to get this information in there. We have to have all this information in there." And I would say they're not going to read it if it's too long. And quite honestly, some of my colleagues are enamored with starting the ABT, starting these conservation notes with the problem. So here's an example. We have what we call wetland easements in North Dakota. The Fish and Wildlife Service pays landowners to keep their wetlands wet. And our congressional delegation is trying to get rid of that. So we're writing this ABT, and the guy who was drafting it, his first sentence was, "The federal government is trying to get rid of wetland easements." Well, that's the problem. not the start of the ABT. And I said to them, you know, given the state of North Dakota's view on conservation, 99% of the legislators are going to read that first sentence and quit because they're in their mind, that's a good thing to get rid of wetland easements. So we struggle mightily. Now, I will say that when it's my turn to draft them, I don't give up. I make my colleagues follow the ABT. They resist it. They always want to put extra stuff in at the end. And my last little bit here is some of you are old enough to remember Hubert Humphrey, former vice president. He was a windy speaker, right? And he would often end his speeches with a conclusion and then would say, and in conclusion, let me say just a few words more. That's pretty much what my colleagues like to do at the end of every ABT. They get the therefore part and then they just can't help themselves. There's more info they got to throw in at the very end.
Good God. Have you made any net progress over the years with them?
No,
No.
honestly, no. Like I said, we started out bad. Well, I shouldn't say bad. We started out where we always start out, right in the deep end of the pool of the AAA. We made some progress for a few years, but as we've all talked about over the course of the years with ABT, it's really hard. It takes work, and my colleagues find it much easier just to throw the pile of information in there and see what sticks, I guess. So no, we're getting worse actually as time goes by.
Okay. All right. On that inspiring note, Doug, you want to jump in and just say a few words about what we were talking about this morning, and then you might segue to some other things to tack on to it, but basically how you've given up trying to pitch a book on ABT to the law world.
Yeah, the science world and the law world has so much in common, but lawyers are problem solvers all day and all night. The interesting kind of connection is science people are problem solvers too, but I'm not a scientist, but in my estimation, you all are solving the problem by doing the work, doing the testing, gathering the data, writing the data. So, communication is not necessarily central to the problem-solving aspect of science. It may be central to solving the problem of getting somebody to care or fund or finance
Wait,
research, but
hang on. Let's
is
slow
that
that
not
down.
true?
No, that's really, really interesting.
Yeah.
Let's think that through of that being a fundamental divide. I've never really thought about it in those terms. What you're saying is that science is sort of the end point of science is just science. Just we found the results. Your end point is actually getting out there and doing something in the real world.
Right. But
Yeah,
that
yeah,
would make
that's
you,
very interesting.
but here's the most interesting part, because the way we solve problems as lawyers is communication,
Yeah.
fundamentally. And you'd think every lawyer would therefore be interested in a method like the ABT that makes them fundamentally unstoppable forces of communication. But they're not. So as Randy mentioned, I wrote a book. It's a nice manuscript. It builds on the book that we did with the narrative Jim and really hammers out a lot of great examples of case studies, and we're just, in depth. And I'll read you the email I got back from the NACDL, which is this is the premier National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. It's the entity for criminal defense lawyers nationwide. And I thought, I'm Moses. I have the Ten Commandments. I'm coming down from the mountain and I'm about to give my people the word, the gospel. And my goodness, will they be grateful and love me and Randy. And the email said, um, Doug, I asked for an update because it was like months and they haven't gotten back to me. I asked for an update on the manuscript you submitted. Unfortunately, NACDL is going to pass. This is the response I received from their editorial board. Quote, it just doesn't fit into what we typically have success with in our publications, end quote. Okay. So I'm so I'm going to either self-publish this or do a Substack or something. I don't know, but the real question is why? How can that be when this is our bread and butter? And you know, I I think, well, here's the thing. Like scientists, we're focused on the data, the and. Spaghetti lawyering, as I call it, is the order of the day, which is throw everything at the wall and hope something sticks. Never works. Here's another big problem, and I think it's one that you share too, that these are highly educated, highly trained professional people who've spent their lives honing their craft and becoming experts in their field. Those are tough nuts to crack a lot of the times because they have a fixed mindset. This is the way I do things. Who are you to come in here? I've been a lawyer for 40 years. Who are you to tell me that I'm doing this wrong? And then, I think maybe I amplify the pain here because what I don't think the hurdle you have in the science community is your hurdle is you were never taught, I think, how to be great communicators.
Hmm.
My hurdle is we were, but we were taught wrong. So I have to convince somebody to unlearn everything that they've not only learned in training and in law school, but that they've been doing for years upon years. So
Yeah,
that's really hard.
this is one of the most interesting moments of discussion I think we've hit in this whole year of all these different sessions that we've done. And let me two little things here. First off, a little side note. These sessions are also intended to be unashamedly networking sessions. And Charles, my good friend Anna Cummins has joined us, and they're developing a science museum in Southern California, and they need an AI component, machine learning, things like that. So I've encouraged her to get in touch with you. So why don't you guys just have a little side direct messaging thing about she could tell you a bit about what they're up to. So very shameless there. But secondly, getting back to this fundamental point, I think a little bit of what we're talking about, and Shirley, you probably got really clear thoughts on this, is what is the end point and for science versus law? And the end point for science, it'd be nice if it had some impact on society, but I honestly think science. I know as a scientist, having been a scientist myself, my endpoint was get a published paper. I didn't care if anybody ever used it in the real world. I just wanted that on my resume. Got it in the. There's this deep-seated belief. If you can get it in the literature, it's there, and someday somebody will make some use out of it. Whereas maybe there's a tiny bit of that with constitutional law or something, Doug, in the law world. Whereas if you can, establish some precedent-setting case, but for the most part, most of what law is actually trying to do something in the real world, get your client off, or who knows what, or get a conviction. And I wonder if that isn't a fundamental divide right there. What is the end point? Because an awful lot of scientists, and Rick, I mean, don't you think that awful lot of scientists are real happy that I just got a paper in the literature and it's on my resume, and maybe it'll get, Julie's nodding her head, maybe someday it'll get cited, but who the hell cares? Let's continue on that line of thought because that's pretty fascinating. Julie,
Well,
oh, sorry. Oh, yeah, Shirley, go for
let me talk to the lawyer. Okay.
it. Doug.
Doug, it would be
Surely,
interesting.
Dr. Malcolm.
It would be interesting to re-argue Buck v. Bill in light of what we understand about genetics today.
I'm gonna have to
Buck v.
Google that.
Bill was the sterilization, 3 generations of imbeciles enough case that went before the Supreme Court. It's a strict eugenics case.
Hmm.
But given what we understand about genetics, it was totally wrong, totally out to lunch.
Hmm.
So the question is research-informed arguments. How do we, in fact, make research-informed arguments? So that means there has to be some communication between what the scientists understand the science to be and what the lawyers can then use to make the argument that the other side is out of their mind.
Okay,
Yeah.
but let me interject into that. Our
Hmm.
catchphrase that comes from the Silicon Valley communications guru, who says nobody buys a solution without a problem. And that's the question is how much is it a problem for scientists versus lawyers if their work does nothing in the real world? And I got a feeling it's a little more of a problem for a lawyer if they build a whole reputation of their work having done nothing in the real world. Whereas there's some scientists I think that are proud of the fact that my work is so profound, no one can even figure out how to use it or whatever. Um, Yeah. Julie, I was calling on you before. So on that topic, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's the publish or perish attitude is, your success is measured by your publication record, and then maybe even your citation index. So if your paper gets cited a lot, you're successful instead of how is that science being applied to the real world or
Okay,
experience.
so now Doug, compare that to law. What's the success scoreboard for law?
Well, okay, so we have to put academics in its own box because
Yeah.
I think people who are
Yeah.
professors, they want to write, they want to be published just for the sake of it. But they're not lawyers. They're legal scholars. Lawyers have clients, which means the consequences matter. The therefore is key. The result is key. All the time, every time, no matter what kind of law you're practicing. The outcome is the goal.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, Rocky.
yeah, I want to push back a little bit on this endpoint for scientists. I think there's two kinds of scientists.
Yeah,
There are theoretical scientists and pure scientists, and
and
then there's
applied.
applied scientists,
Yeah.
and which I'm part of. And our end goal is to actually have an impact on conservation or whatever other aspect of.
Yeah, but wait a second. Your whole wiper thing, the only reason you were writing that was just to get it in the literature, you told me.
Well, actually, no. That there were two reasons. One is there's the scientific reason, and the applied reason is that we had evidence of plastic pollution killing these oriental darters, an oriental darter, which has never been recorded for Asia,
Mm.
but it had been for South America, and North America. So we wanted to document that, and I also wanted to work with these Bhutanese colleagues to get them the experience of going through the process of dealing with the scientific review process and submitting papers, which they had never done before. So there was a twofold thing. One
Mm.
was the applied aspect of it, and the other one is sort of an altruistic thing on my part, wanting to get them this experience.
So let's see, Jeff, you had a comment?
Yeah, this is fantastic. So I'm an associate editor for a journal. So I'm not making the final decision. I'm the referee, right? I'm dealing with the peer reviews and sort of playing both sides, making sure they're being fair, making sure that the paper's what it should be. Well, I'm not pushing ABT style stuff like explicitly, but it's in my mind, right? This is what makes sense to me and how you tell the story. The pushback I get from certain colleagues we are in a circle. We don't need ABT. We don't need it. And is
Hmm.
what we understand. So why do we need to do something different? And I'm sort of thinking that, and a couple of folks have touched on this. I think through our scientific training, we have maybe been taught some really, really bad behaviors that the actual narrative ABT philosophy is the intuitive thing, whether you're a scientist or not. And we've sort of created this artificial thing. We have to like sort of unlearn our bad behaviors, maybe. And that's, some of these people, that's why the editor's changing this, because this is what's worked and et cetera.
Okay, yeah, Leo, go for it.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, so I'm an epidemiologist. I've worked in industry, and you're right. I think that we were always trained to be thorough. Okay, tell you all the details, and or people will assume you don't, you didn't think of it or something. And yeah, I think it's a problem. And I think eventually, I always see publication as, and I've liked how some journals would do it. Like, hey, why does this matter? What's the implication? Because after a while that gets empty. I publish things and then you want something like, hey, what did I accomplish with it? So my 2 cents.
Yeah. And on a side note, I traded emails with Shirley a few days ago about this, but I'm starting to fire up on a major life mission here, which is what we're about to do in 2 weeks is going to be an experiment that'll be fascinating with these folks in Florida. on communication on a little bit of a separate track, but it's relevant to everything we're talking about here, which is, um, 100 years ago, the science community thought more clearly than today. That's one of my fundamental points. Nobody wants to talk about that and concede that we are stupider today than we were 100 years ago, but we really were in a lot of these different dynamics. And the science world came together and established this convention about the structure of scientific papers, the MRAD template, that all papers ought to have this four-part structure: introduction, methods, results, and discussion. And it eventually caught fire. It took 50 years with the medical journals. I've studied this a little bit. It's amazing how long it did take. But today, it's absolutely unquestioned. Nobody's writing essays about, we need to come up with a different structure. It worked. They nailed it. It's ABT way back then. And the extra add-on on that is that every paper begins with this short paragraph abstract. So they tell you the basic essence of what you're about to read in this whole big paper right there in one paragraph. Now, the experiment that we're doing, and I'll talk quietly here because this is kind of confidential, but we've got these folks in Florida who did not have enough time to do our full training. And so we've worked with them on these 15-minute talks they're doing, which is 15 minutes nowadays is really a lot of time for a presentation. The medical ones we're doing tomorrow are going to be only 5 minutes, and those we've gotten to razor sharp structure. But with the Florida ones, we did not have enough time to work with. They weren't able to allocate enough time. So one of the little semi band-aids we're going to do on it is that we've put together a one-sentence short conversational one-sentence ABT that will go at the beginning of all 15 of these talks. And I've kind of picked this up from Patty Limerick, who's been part of our group over the years. And 10 years ago, she learned the ABT and she gave a big keynote address that she began by putting up the first slide, had her one sentence ABT. She said she turned her back to the 500 people in the audience and read it off the screen. And people came up to her at the reception and said, "Oh my God, I've never sat through a whole half-hour presentation that in the first minute, I knew exactly what it was going to be about." It's the same basic structure, I think, as having an abstract at the beginning of a written paper. It's just that the science world has lost all leadership. There's nobody in a position to try and lead the whole community and say the time has maybe come to consider oral verbal communication like this, that it needs some structure as well, because still to this day, you can get up there and give a rambling 15-minute, half an hour keynote thing. I get text messages all the time from people that just say, "I just sat through a whole opening keynote thing. I can't make heads or tails out of it." There's absolutely no structure applied to verbal communication. And I just wonder, that's another thing to be talking about here and thinking about. What would the science community say to that? No, no. And I've been through this before. People have said, no, we don't want to constrain people's creativity when it comes to, giving these talks. And everybody prides themselves on being the greatest speaker ever. So they really resent any sort of constraint like that. And yet, why not? Rick Nelson, what are your thoughts on that concept?
Well, I love it. I think it's the next iteration in the evolution of the ABT. And I've mentioned this to Randy many times over the years. I had a colleague in grad school who would start every presentation with, "Now I'm going to tell you a story," and then he never did. It never was. So, and Randy and I talked about this the other day. I really like it. I think this is key to what we've just been talking about. You've got to give people right away what this is. The conversational ABT, we kind of lose that a little bit in the discussions, but it's a really powerful tool. And it gets your attention. And I think it's really important for people who are not in the inner circle to be told right off the top, this is what this is about and why it's important.
Yeah, I think so. Exactly. Julie Clausen, what do you think about that idea and other thoughts?
Yeah, and just to you may not agree with me, Randy, but I feel like there is due to the Doge, due to government cuts, due to federal funding, that there is now an awakening on how bad we have communicated, and there's a hunger out there. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I am noticing more and more inquiries and comments, especially from the younger crowd, of we've got to learn how to communicate. We've got to do better. We have failed.
Yeah.
And so I feel that there's a groundswell and an opportunity here to really make some changes.
And there might well being. We've got a few circumstances now. I mean, we've got major momentum happening at Emory University Medical School. We've done this course for 4 years, and they're loving it. And when I went down there, blah, 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 on and on. But we've also got a group at FAA, their Aviation Research Center in New Jersey, that also have hit this tipping point. And as soon as they get back online the next few days, recovering from the shutdown, but they departed before the shutdown saying, as soon as we come back online, we're ready to, they've got some giant contract with some big, run-of-the-mill communications training organization that they're going to try and put us inside of that. But that might be a place for us to start the ball rolling on this. But it's a matter of trying to find a critical mass that we could introduce that idea of, yeah.
Randy,
Charles.
can I interject just to say, I think Julie's right. I just came home from the ASTMH conference, American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene, and there were multiple sessions about how do you communicate. And Michael Lewis won a big award for global health communication on a book called Pandemic that he wrote, or Premonition.
Yeah, Premonition. Yeah,
and he gave a little 3-minute video spiel accepting the reward, and he said he was glad to get it for this, mostly because it highlights the importance of communication. And he said, we are in a battle for narrative right now, and we need to communicate really well. So
who knew?
Yeah.
Gee, I wish I would have written a book titled Narrative is Everything about
That's right.
5 or 6 years ago.
So if based on that conference, Julie is absolutely right that the global health community realizes the shit has hit the fan partly because of poor communication, and we've got to nail it.
Well, all right, Steve Kern, you're one of the grand masters here. Weigh in on the idea of trying to introduce this concept. For starters, a very specific thing of suggesting at least what we're going to do in Florida, which is all 15 talks. We'll begin with that one sentence ABT that they will read off the screen. And we just pulled together the first drafts in this morning, and everyone just, therefore, I'm going to tell you about what we're doing with this that just gets people in that shallow end. Steve, what do you think?
Hey, Randy, I wonder if you created the magic prompt words from ChatGPT so that one sentence could be automatically created from all 15 of those papers, and people saw it. Right.
Yeah.
It didn't have to be perfect, but they saw.
Hang on. Slow down. Explain in detail what you're talking about.
Well, just, the paper. So ChatGPT reads the paper and says, here's your one sentence starter point, and just throws it out there for someone to start with. Right.
Yeah.
Now I've just lowered the barrier. Now it's like, oh, hell, I can edit this. This is actually pretty easy. And that might be one way that you start to get over some of this resistance, right? The resistance is because it's hard. And right now, as you said, nobody's got a problem, right? No editor is giving me messages. I'm sorry, you're not published in Nature because you don't have ABT structure. So nobody perceives they have a problem.
Yeah. No, that's really,
you got to help them figure out how to do this easier.
No, that's really, really good. Liz, you sat through my bitch session this morning after I spent hours last night. I did what ChatGPT would do, as you're talking about there. I took all 15 of these talks last night. We had these big bulky ABTs that we'd worked out with them that had everything in there, and they were probably about 200 words. And then I shrunk them down to about 25 to 30 word ABTs. That'll be conversation, could be read off a screen, because the big bulky thing would ruin lose the audience. And then Liz and Matthew had to listen to me complain about that this morning, because it did take a ton of effort. And yet what we finished with this morning is what they're going to send back to the individuals, saying, here's what we've got. Give us your next round of fine tuning these things. As you're saying there, we're giving them that draft. Liz, your thoughts on my bitch session this morning?
One, bless you for going through all of that, because my brain was already shot. But no, I think the difference it will make, especially with some of these talks too, of just it creates some sense of direction, which I know when I looked at some of the presentations was like, I need something.
Okay. So on that note, Doug, is this not the case that happens in legal trials? Is the judge eventually saying, where is this line of questioning leading? Things like that, where they interrupt the lawyer who's just going on with a whole bunch of questions or whatever, and they failed to lay out an ABT at the beginning, and therefore I'm going to now take you to, why we think this, and here comes the questions. Does that not happen in legal proceedings?
It does, not just on TV, but in real life. And
Yeah.
and it happens that a lawyer who's doing a closing argument will just ramble and ramble and ramble, and it goes nowhere. And eventually the judge may not say, where's this going, but they'll say, you got 10 more minutes and wrap this up. And they do that all the time because they're just wasting time and spinning their wheels. I have to go back though, because I always get a chuckle when you talk about IMRAD, because here's another similarity. We have IRAC. That's what we're taught, IRAC, issue, rule, application, conclusion. That is the formula that we're given as
Jesus.
law students to how to do legal
Hang on, let me
writing.
make that a note of that.
And
Issue, what?
rule,
Mm-hmm.
application,
Mm-hmm.
and conclusion.
Wow.
So what does issue sound like to you? Because to me, it sounds like the problem. Like,
Yeah.
what is the issue here? So again, we lead with the problem too. So there's so many overlaps. And I will say this, as far as conversational ABT, yes, yes, yes. And for me, my great love in this process is the Dov Johnsky. I think that there's infinite value there at the very beginning to say, nothing in this case makes sense except in light of
Well, and
vulnerability. Because,
the,
in
yeah.
terms of setting the stakes and kind of giving a promise that you're going to deliver on and getting people interested, whenever I say it, I go, people are going to be like, okay, what the fuck are you talking about? But they're listening, and then I can really dig in. But it also gives me complete narrative control for every little thread of the story as I go along and along, because I always have something I can fall back on
Yeah,
in that
yeah.
one
Well,
thing.
okay, but like Charles, in that Michael Lewis, he gave a talk actually that you heard.
He got
Was
an
it?
award for getting a book, and then he gave a little 3 minute, I accept this reward and thank you for it. And here's
Oh
why it
wow.
matters.
Okay, well that's extremely concise. It was only 3 minutes, not a half hour talk. But um, don't you think he would buy into the Dobzhansky as part of the solution of forcing people to try and at least attempt to boil down your complicated thing into the central element?
Oh, I would
As
say absolutely. Yeah, he's a great writer. I
yeah.
know Shirley has something to say. I know.
Oh, sorry, Shirley,
I just want to come back to something that you just kind of ran past as you were talking,
as I tend to do.
and that's audience. I think people get confused about who they're trying to tell that to. And if you lose a sense of who your audience is, you will speak inappropriately. Okay, the judge as the audience is different from the jury as the audience. The
Yeah.
judge carries a lot more knowledge of like the guardrails that are operating there, but the jury is the one you're trying to convince. The that's how some people are able to swing jury nullification because they recognize
Mm.
who they're talking to and they are able to position the story in ways that people can put themselves into it. And that is, I think, we just keep forgetting that. And I just say, audience, audience, audience. You can talk about, these other elements, but I really think that audience is right up there.
Okay, if I can do something semi-rude, what are you doing these days, Shirley? Are you giving talks on these sorts of things? You've got so much to say. Are you out there giving big talks, or you just save it all for this group? It's amazing. Because that jury nullification, thinking along those lines, you're absolutely right. And we talk about inner circle, outer circle, and that's similar sort of dynamic. But then shaping it and framing it for a very specific audience like that is a different whole mindset from the judge. Steve, you got something?
Yeah, just one thing I was thinking about, Randy, is that maybe PowerPoint is the enemy, right? And that, because Doug, there's no lawyers doing closing arguments with a PowerPoint deck, right? None.
No,
And
there
and
are. There
there
are.
are? Oh God.
And
Oh my God.
most of them are horrible.
Yeah, okay.
But they do it. They
But
definitely do
But my
that.
point is, and I was thinking about premonition, right? Because one of the sub protagonists is Richard Hatchett in Premonition, and Richard Hatchett used to run the Midas program at the White House on pandemic preparedness, blah blah blah. He now runs CEPI. Richard Hatchett gave the best talk I ever heard about quantitative modeling, and there were no words in any of his slides. There were only pictures. And so one challenge, Randy, that might be helpful is if you told your audience, your people in Florida or in Georgia, you can put no words in your slides. All you can do is have pictures. Now, all of a sudden, the whole thing is resting on a story that I'm telling, and it's going to force people into narrative, where if they just are putting pile after pile after pile of sentence, and it becomes the and generator, right? And I'm just curious if that might be a technique to get people on board.
Well, I went to film school 30 years ago, and you would think I would have thought of this idea that you're just suggesting right now from given my background, because the whole first year at the USC Cinema School, we were not allowed to touch sound. We had to learn to tell a story through images, silent movies. We made these little 5-minute films our first semester there. I wish Greg were here. He could match notes on this. We have all these fond recollections. But that's exactly, and what's fascinating is that USC Cinema School has this enormous body of collective knowledge over the course of 100 years of when I was there. They had their 75-year anniversary. And it shows in how they teach. And that's one of the key things is, we came in, we were told, it's great that you love all this music, but you're not going to get to touch it for a year. You're going to spend a year telling a story with sheer imagery. And then, of course, that became the rule of thumb. And all these people I try to work with on public service announcements, try and tell them the acid test is turn the volume off on your 1-minute public service announcement. And can the viewer make sense of what the hell it is that you're trying to? And most academics go right to the narration, the words, and you turn the volume off, and nothing makes sense for anything. And so you're absolutely right. And Liz, why have we not thought of that? Although I don't think that would be the right experiment for 2 weeks from now in Florida. That's a really tough thing, and it runs the risk of their stuff being a mess.
Yeah,
and we can't afford to have that with this one. But we should have done it with some group previous to now.
One way we tried this, and well, it's interesting. It didn't come through this, but I had to once give something called an Ignite speech, where you basically have 15 seconds a slide, 20 slides, 5 minutes, and the slides just automatically change, right?
Oh,
So,
wow.
and one of the things I realized is if I had thought about the ABT beforehand, it would have been a hell of a lot easier to keep on track. Because the one problem you always get is you get behind because you're anding, right? And then the next thing you know, you're like, shit, I'm talking about slide 3 and it's on 7, right? So, so I think that might be a tool again to help where it's changing every 15 seconds. It's just a picture. I'm telling a story and I'm narrating this along the way. But if I don't have good structure, boy, I'm just going to stumble and get stuck. And that's what happens.
That's hilarious. Charles, did you hear any good talks at that meeting?
Yeah, but there were also people who couldn't keep in their time limit. And in the scientific, so I'm on a scientific committee. So there was a meeting of the scientific committee people to talk about what to change. And people said, we need training in how to give talks so that we stay within the time limit. Yeah. And I actually volunteered to bring you on board for that. So
we're up for that. The problem is that the communication world is not a collaborative world. It's a competitive world, and there are all these high budgeted corporations with all their slick garbage that I don't feel like burning up my energy trying to compete. We're having so much fun right now.
Well, luckily, the association or American Society for Tropical Medicine and Hygiene is not a high budget operation because it's doing tropical medicine, right? Yeah. But then no, it's recognized that people cannot keep within their time limit because of lack of communication training. That was a big awareness at this conference.
Yeah. Well, can you please go back and tell them that I had dengue fever once upon a time, and therefore I feel a sentimental attachment to their topic. So I'd be more than happy to do some work with them. So let's see, Liz, we see any people want to comment from the chat window? Let's see. Albie, did you want to say something?
Most of it was a PowerPoint thing that we were talking about a little bit, but it's a story structure, and it's still that time and time again. Like I get slides, and it's your notes for what you wanted to talk about, right? It's a bullet point of notes, and it's not actually a presentation. And so I think a lot of times I'm always telling people that you've got to step 2 when you're making a presentation, whether it's verbal or a PowerPoint slide. Like you made yourself a notes, you figured out the order and the content you want to talk about, and then you forgot to finish making the presentation, right? Yeah. You're standing there with your notes and you're just talking, and so people are reading off their slides, and it's just text heavy and 10, 18-point font, and you can't follow any of it. So it's kind of
Gosh.
like, I always try to encourage people to finish the presentation, actually make the presentation now that you have an outline.
Well, gosh, Liz, does any of that hit home for what we've been through for the past 2 months? Yeah, a lot of that. One little tidbit to share that it still sticks with me. 28 years later, right after I got out of film school, I made a 22-minute film called Talking Science and interviewed a whole bunch of scientists and folks about communication. And one thing, we went to a big ocean science meeting and asked a lot of people walking around at the poster session for interviews of tell us the best and the worst presentations you ever sat through. There were endless bad presentation examples, very few best presentations, but one that the guy told that we put in the video that still crystal clear sticks with me. The guy said, best presentation I ever saw was from a Nobel Prize winner who'd worked on photosynthesis. And his entire talk, he had a pitcher of water and a glass. The glass was a chloroplast. The water was photons and the pitcher was the sun. And this guy talked about his whole model of how chloroplasts work, just pouring water into the glass. And that was about all he had, I mean, that takes the mind of a Nobel level scientist to distill down all this complexity into something that simple that he said everybody in the audience just got it, what he was talking about or the hell it was. And such a simple thing. It's not, that's the problem with all this stuff is simplicity, as we know over the ages. That's the big challenge. And it takes a lot of kind of experience and ability to just grasp context to crack the nut of simplicity. And that's what was draining yesterday, going through all these bulky ABTs, trying to get them down to something simple that would work to kind of open things up for the audience. Let's see, we're at the 5-minute warning.
Leo has a
Leo,
hand up.
yeah.
Leo, yeah.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So, Randy, I was going to say, when you were working with us, one of the things that really stuck with me was not from the point of view of the audience is don't make people listen to you, choose between listening to you and reading the slides. And once I got that, I thought, God, I don't ever want to do that to anybody, right? So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a way that it sticks with people, because I feel like most people in that experience would say, oh yeah, I don't like that conflict. I'd rather just listen to the person than watch the slides, and then you try to do both.
Yeah,
Can I just add, there is a lot of well-established science that we handle only one semantic stream at a time. We cannot read and listen. We cannot listen and write. It's just not possible. So that's maybe a way to get at that same notion, Leo, that science says you can do this, X, or this.
Yeah, great.
Okay, but let me counterbalance that with something. This is the kind of stuff that just grates against me, is that we also use Nicholas Kristof's paper endlessly in our training, that he goes through the whole thing about the singular narrative. As soon as you go from one central theme to two, you already are losing focus with your audience. There are these hardcore, well-proven principles, and then you listen to a bunch of academics talking, you listen to news pundits on the evening news or whatever, and you will get the pundit in there who says, I'd like to think that people can keep two thoughts in their mind at once. They can't. Why do academics say those sorts of things? And then you go from there into what Andy Revkin and I commiserate about, which is complicating the narrative. There's a whole school of journalists and writers that are advocating this idea that, the best way we can get these things across is you got to be brave as a journalist and throw everything out there and get the whole No, you don't. I mean, it's just cultural war at that point. And that then becomes a question of who will establish the louder voice that can really be listened to. And there is no voice of leadership in the science world. After my entire journey of 30 years, I've come to that conclusion. I don't know how much else I can do. 12 books, one of which is with University of Chicago Press on how to communicate science. And I end up talking at Emory. They had me meet with the two head people on communication there at their medical school. And they did not know anything of these books, any of this sort of stuff, anything about narrative structure, and they just talked down to me like I was some graduate student wanting to get into science communication. And I just had to sit there and endure it. So that's what you get. And those people get hired for big contracts to come in and train everybody on communication, blah, blah. So anyhow, that's the dark side of that. Doug, what are you saying there? And we're kind of wrapping things up here.
Oh, no, I was just responding to Jeff's comment about walking and chewing gum. But
Anna, did you have a comment?
I might save this for next time. I just was thinking about in terms sensory experience. Like I heard this one woman give a talk, and she talked about how if you can embed appealing to people's other senses into a talk, that it makes things more memorable. And the example she used, and this was like 6 years ago, and I still remember it, is she ate an apple on stage, like during her presentation, and sort of wove that into her talk. And you, as the audience person, like kind of like tasted and had that experience with her. It was visual, it was sensory. So I thought that was kind of interesting. I don't really know that
Well,
it.
okay, that's excellent. And I will connect that for our final thought here with actually, an episode I did 2 or 3 years ago of our podcast with Bruce Block, who is the longtime visual expression instructor at USC Film School. And, 30 years later after film school, I had him on the podcast. But his course there is probably the most important enduring course at USC Cinema School. He's taught it for 40 years or so. And it's about visual expression and his 7 elements of line, shape, form, tone, blah, 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 all these things. And we learned how to use all these elements of visual expression. But rule number one is that everything has to be in service to the narrative. And you can have cameras spinning around doing all these special effects, but if they aren't serving to advance the narrative and build to what the narrative's working towards, then they're distractions. And that's what I'd say about the eating the apple. That is tremendous if you can find a way for that to be supporting the narrative of what you're trying to do. But all too often, people do those gimmicks and everybody walks away. Oh my God, that's amazing. Why was she eating the apple? I don't know, but it was cool.
Yeah, and then that's all you remember, because I
that's
just
all you
watched
remember. That's what you got it. And that
at-
was what you got at USC Film School, was all these kids of wealthy parents, and the parents gave them unlimited amount of money to go and rent all these cranes and all these special effects and Steadicam operators and shoot these films where the cameras are spinning in circles and visually dazzling. And the audience walks out like, I don't know what it was about, but man, those cameras sure spun around. And that is the idea, that everything needs to be in service to the narrative and build towards something. And otherwise, it's just and fun time. And so, unfortunately, we are at the end of the hour. Thank you so much, Rocky and Rick and Doug and everybody else. I knew this was going to be a good topic, and it's really a year-long thoughts that everybody's kind of brought to this that we've got. And yeah, I want to talk with a bunch of you guys more about this. We'll continue it next week. So everybody come back again next week. Yay. I'm gonna go eat an apple.
Everybody.
Yeah.
See ya.